The late afternoon light painted the desert in shades of copper and blood when Grandma Eleanor felt the ropes tighten around her wrists against the rock. The wind carried fine sand that scratched her aged skin, and she could hear the footsteps of her grandchildren receding, growing more distant until the desert's silence swallowed everything whole. Her eyes, blurred by tears and dust, could still make out 3 silhouettes against the blazing horizon. 3 people she had raised, nourished, loved. 3 people who were now leaving her to die. Before we dive into this story, drop a comment below with your rating from 1 to 10 and tell us where you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. Grandma Eleanor was 78 years old and knew that desert like the back of her hand. She had been born there, in a small community that made its living raising goats and from hardscrabble farming, resisting the drought with the stubbornness of someone who knew no other home. She had raised 3 children in that arid land, buried her husband beneath a saguaro cactus that still bloomed every December, and watched her children leave, one by one, in search of a life the harsh desert lands couldn't offer. Her grandchildren remained. Michael, the eldest, 32, with an ambition that burned in his eyes like a fever. Sarah, 28, who had inherited a chronic guilt from her absent mother and a people-pleasing need that made her accept the unacceptable. And Daniel, the youngest at 25, who spoke little and observed much, carrying a silence on his shoulders that no one could decipher. That year's drought had been the worst in decades. The wells dried up, the goats died, and the community where Grandma Eleanor had lived her entire life scattered like leaves in the wind. Some went to the big city, others to the coast, and those who remained were swallowed by dust and oblivion. Only she and her 3 grandchildren were left, who had promised their dying mother years before that they would look after their grandmother until the end. But promises, Eleanor had learned, were like water in the desert, precious when present, cruel when absent. The idea had come from Michael, like all ideas involving risk and reward. He had heard tales of an oasis, a legendary place beyond the stone mountains where water sprang. From the earth and trees bore fruit year-round, a hidden paradise only the bravest found. Grandma Eleanor knew that story. Her own grandmother used to tell of Hope Valley, a place that existed more in faith than in geography, a dream that kept the desert dwellers walking when all seemed lost. She tried to explain to her grandchildren that it was a legend, that the desert didn't hold such generous secrets, but Michael wouldn't listen. He never did. The journey began on a moonless night, before the heat had truly woken. Grandma Eleanor didn't want to go. She felt in her bones that this journey wouldn't end well, but her grandchildren insisted. They needed her, they said. She knew the desert, could read the signs of the earth, the stones, the wind. What they didn't say, but she understood, was that they also needed someone to carry the blame if everything went wrong. That's how broken families worked. There was always a scapegoat, always someone to abandon when the burden grew too heavy. The first few days were difficult, but bearable. They walked at dawn and dusk, resting during the hottest hours under the meager shade of rocks and dry bushes. Water was carefully rationed, and Grandma Eleanor, despite her age, kept pace without complaint. She watched her grandchildren in silence, noticing the tensions growing between them like cracks in an old wall. Michael became increasingly impatient, blaming the desert, the heat, his grandmother for walking too slowly. Sarah tried to mediate, her voice always conciliatory, always asking for a little more patience. Daniel said nothing, but his eyes followed his grandmother, with an expression she couldn't decipher. Was it compassion or farewell? On the 5th day they found the first sign that something was wrong. A group of travelers, 3 men and a woman, were coming from the opposite direction. They were thin, their eyes sunken, their skin burned by the sun and despair. When Michael asked about the oasis, the oldest of the group laughed, a dry, rattling sound that seemed to scratch his throat. "There's no oasis," he said. "There's only more desert, more thirst, more death." They had lost 2 companions in the search and were now returning defeated, carrying only the bones of hope. Michael didn't believe them. He said those men were weak, that they didn't have enough faith, that the oasis existed and he would find it. Grandma Eleanor saw the madness glint in her grandson's eyes and felt her heart clench. She knew that glint. It was the same one she'd seen in her husband's eyes before he'd left on a hunting trip he never returned from. It was the glint in the eyes of someone who decided reality didn't matter, only their obsession. From that encounter onward, things began to fall apart. The water ran out faster than expected, and Michael blamed his grandmother, saying she drank too much, that she was dead weight, that they were carrying a breathing corpse. Sarah defended Grandma Eleanor with tears in her eyes, but her defense was weak, full of buts and maybes that convinced no one. Daniel remained silent, and his silence was the most terrifying of all, because Grandma Eleanor couldn't tell whose side he was on. It was on a full moon night, when the desert shimmered like an ocean of silver, that Grandma Eleanor awoke to rough hands grabbing her arms. Michael stood before her, his face a mask of stone. Sarah cried softly, her shoulders trembling, but she didn't move to help. Daniel held the ropes. At first, Grandma Eleanor didn't understand. She thought they were being attacked by bandits, that they needed to escape, that the ropes were for some purpose she couldn't grasp. But then Michael spoke, and his words fell like stones into the dry well of her heart. "You're a burden, Gram. We can't make it to the oasis carrying you. It's for the best. The desert will take care of you." She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. She wanted to fight, but her old arms had no strength. She wanted to cry, but her tears had dried up along with her. Hope. She just lay there, tied to the rock, watching her grandchildren walk away without looking back. Michael led the way, his steps firm, carrying no remorse. Sarah stumbled behind, looking at the ground as if afraid to meet her grandmother's eyes. And Daniel, the silent one, paused for a moment and turned his head. And Grandma Eleanor could have sworn she saw something in his eyes, something that looked like a plea for forgiveness. But then he too was swallowed by the night, and she was left alone with the desert and her own breath. The cold arrived first, a chill that seemed impossible in that land of relentless sun. Grandma Eleanor shivered, her teeth chattering, her bones aching as if they wanted to separate from her flesh. She thought of the children she had raised, the grandchildren she had loved, the promises she had made to her husband before he left. She had promised to care for the family, to keep them all together, to be the rock they could lean on. And now she was there, tied to a literal rock, abandoned by the very ones she had sworn to protect. The stars appeared one by one, like candles being lit at a wake. Grandma Eleanor knew them all. She had learned their names from her father when she was a girl, and now they seemed to look back at her with an indifference that was almost comforting. The desert didn't hate her, she realized. The desert simply existed, indifferent to human suffering, to betrayal, to abandonment. There was an honesty in that which human beings lacked. She closed her eyes and waited for death to come. She was tired. So tired that even fear seemed distant, like something that belonged to someone else. But death didn't come. Instead, something different came, something Grandma Eleanor couldn't explain, even after everything that happened. The rock against her back began to vibrate. At first, she thought she was delirious, that the thirst and cold were confusing her senses. But the vibration was real, a deep pulsation that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. The sand around her began to move, not blown by the wind, but as if it had a life of its own, as if the desert itself were breathing. Grandma Eleanor felt fear return, sharp and biting, but along with it came something more, an ancient curiosity. The same she'd felt as a child, discovering hidden secrets in stones and plants. The rope binding her wrists began to unravel, not cut, but disintegrated, as if time itself were consuming it. The rock against her back grew hot, then warm, then glowed with a soft light that seemed to come from within it. Grandma Eleanor stood, her legs trembling but firm, and looked around. The desert had changed. The dunes that once seemed like mountains of death now undulated softly, as if alive. The stars shone more intensely, and she could hear sounds she'd never noticed before: the whisper of the sand, the distant call of night birds, the pulse of underground water running through invisible veins in the earth. It was as if a blindfold had been lifted from her eyes, and now she could see the world as it truly was. And then she understood. The desert hadn't abandoned her. The desert had chosen her. Grandma Eleanor spent the entire night standing, absorbing what the desert offered her. It wasn't magic in the sense of the stories she told her grandchildren when they were little, no spells or enchantments. It was something deeper, more ancient, a connection to the earth that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. She realized now that the desert was not a place of death, but of transformation. Everything that seemed barren was, in fact, teeming with hidden life, waiting for the right moment to bloom. When the sun rose, dyeing the dunes pink and gold, Grandma Eleanor discovered she no longer felt hunger or thirst. Her body, which had ached in every joint the day before, now moved with a lightness she hadn't experienced since her youth. Her eyes, once blurred by age and the cataracts that were beginning to form, saw with impressive clarity. She could spot a lizard 300 yards away, could distinguish the different layers of rock in the mountains on the horizon, could perceive the heat shimmer announcing midday. But the most extraordinary thing was what she felt inside, a nameless peace, a certainty that needed no explanation. She knew with a conviction that came from the depths of her bones that she now had a purpose. The desert had saved her not out of kindness, but out of necessity. There was work to be done, and she was the one chosen to do it. The following days were filled with learning. Grandma Eleanor discovered she could sense underground water, a skill she had always possessed weakly, but which now manifested with astonishing precision. She knew exactly where to dig to find a well, where the water flowed closest to the surface, where ancient aquifers held their liquid treasures. She also discovered that the desert animals didn't fear her. Lizards came to her, snakes passed by without attacking, scorpions ignored her as if she were part of the landscape. Even the vultures, which once circled lost travelers like harbingers of death, watched her from afar with something that looked like respect. She began to walk, not in search of the legendary oasis her grandchildren pursued, but in search of those who needed help. She found the first group a week later, a family of displaced persons, a father, mother, and 3 small children who had gotten lost while fleeing the drought. They were nearly dead when Grandma Eleanor found them, their lips cracked, their skin burning with fever. She guided them to a well no one else could have found, a place where fresh, clean water sprang from seemingly barren rocks. She gave them directions to the nearest town, and when they asked her name, she simply smiled and said she was a traveler, nothing more. The story spread like wildfire, a mysterious old woman who appeared out of nowhere to save the lost. A white-haired woman who knew every stone, every grain of sand, every secret of that relentless desert. The desert folk began to call her the Guardian, a title she never asked for but didn't refuse either, because, deep down, that was exactly what she had become, the guardian of a land everyone feared and few understood. Meanwhile, on the other side of the desert, her grandchildren faced the hell they had chosen. Michael awoke the day after the abandonment with a throbbing headache and a thirst that felt like it was corroding his throat from the inside. The water had run out during the night, The canteen he had guarded so carefully, now empty and useless. Sarah slept restlessly a few yards away, murmuring incomprehensible words, likely dreaming of the grandmother they had left behind. Daniel was awake, sitting on a rock, staring at the horizon with that empty expression Michael had always interpreted as stupidity, but which now began to seem like something more, perhaps scorn. They walked all day without finding anything. The sun punished them without mercy, and the hot air felt solid, an invisible wall they had to push against with every step. Michael insisted they were on the right path, that the oasis was near, that they just needed to keep going. But his voice no longer carried the same conviction as before, and Sarah noticed it. She walked in silence, her eyes swollen from crying, and each time she looked at her older brother, she felt a growing anger. She didn't dare express. Night brought a biting cold and no hope. They found shelter among rocks, but the wind found every crack, every hole, turning sleep into torture. Sarah awoke several times screaming, always the same nightmare. Her grandmother tied to the stone, her eyes fixed on her mouth forming words Sarah couldn't hear. Michael pretended to sleep, but his eyes remained open in the dark, staring at nothing, calculating options that didn't exist. Daniel was the first to find water 2 days later, a tiny trickle seeping from a crack in the rock, so faint it would almost go unnoticed. He discovered it by chance, by resting his hand on the stone for support and feeling the unexpected dampness. He called his siblings, and for a moment they all forgot their differences, gathered around that liquid miracle, drinking precious drops that barely wet their throats, but the water wasn't enough to quell the tension. That night, Sarah finally exploded. "It's your fault," she said to Michael, her voice trembling with rage and exhaustion. "We abandoned Grandma because of you, because of your stupid obsession with an oasis that doesn't exist." Michael jumped to his feet, his face contorted. "I did what had to be done. She was slowing us down. She was going to die anyway." "You don't know that," Sarah shouted. "You don't know anything. You're just like our father, running from problems, abandoning those who needed you." The mention of their father was like a slap. The 3 siblings had different memories of the man who had sired them and disappeared when they were still children, but none of them were good. Michael clenched his fists, his jaw locked, and for a moment Sarah thought he was going to hit her. But then Daniel stood up, placing himself between the two, and his silence was more eloquent than any words. "We need to go back," Daniel said. It was the first complete sentence he had uttered in days, and his voice sounded strange, hoarse from disuse and thirst. "Go back for what?" Michael almost spat the words. "To bury her bones." "To ask for forgiveness," Daniel replied, "even if it's too late." The argument continued into the night, but something had changed. Michael's certainty was cracked, and through those cracks seeped a guilt he desperately tried to ignore. Sarah cried silently, hugging her own knees, rocking back and forth like a frightened child. And Daniel remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the stars, as if seeking in the constellations an answer humans couldn't give. They didn't go back. Michael refused, and his refusal was law. They kept walking forward, always forward, toward a horizon that never drew closer. The water ran out again, the food had been gone for days, and hunger began to seem less important than thirst. Their bodies protested with every step, but they continued, driven by an inertia that no longer had anything to do with hope. It was then they found the first signs. A footprint in the sand, small and light, that shouldn't exist in such a remote place. Then staff marks, deep and regular, as if someone walked there often. And finally, on the 3rd day after the argument, they found a goat. A live, healthy goat, grazing on a bush that shouldn't exist in the middle of that barren desert. The animal looked at them without fear, chewing calmly, as if the presence of 3 emaciated humans was no cause for concern. Michael wanted to kill it immediately, But Sarah objected. "If there's a goat here," she said, "someone's taking care of it. Maybe we can ask for help." They followed the goat when it moved away, and it guided them along a path none of them would have found alone. Between seemingly impassable rocks, through passages so narrow they had to walk sideways, until they finally reached a place that seemed straight out of a dream. A hidden valley nestled among stone mountains, where vegetation grew green and lush. A stream ran between the trees, and the air had a coolness that made their lungs ache, so accustomed were they to the dry heat. There were goats everywhere, and chickens, and even some fruit trees laden with ripe fruit. And in the center of it all, sitting under the shade of an old cottonwood tree, was a woman. Michael recognized her first, or rather, his body recognized her, before his mind could process the information. He stopped walking, his knees giving way, and would have fallen if Daniel hadn't caught him. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, a moan escaping between her fingers. The woman had white hair that shone like silver under the sun filtered by the leaves. Her skin, once wrinkled and spotted by age, now looked smooth and healthy, radiating an impossible vitality. Her eyes, which had been brown and tired, now held a golden glint, as if they contained the sun itself. She wore simple clothes, made of raw fabric, and on her bare feet the earth seemed to mold itself to receive her. It was Grandma Eleanor, and at the same time, it wasn't. She watched them in silence for a long moment, and in that silence the three grandchildren felt the weight of everything they had done. There was no anger in her gaze, no accusation, no desire for vengeance that they secretly expected. There was only a profound serenity, a peace that seemed to come from a place beyond human comprehension. "You took your time," she finally said, and her voice was like the whisper of the wind across the dunes, soft yet charged with power. "The desert told me you were coming 3 days ago." Michael opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. All the arrogance, all the certainty, all the justifications he had built in his mind crumbled before this figure who was both his grandmother and something entirely different. He fell to his knees, not in reverence, but because his legs simply refused to continue bearing the weight of his guilt. "Grandma," Sarah whispered, tears streaming freely down her face. "Forgive me. Please, forgive me." Grandma Eleanor stood and walked to them, her steps making no sound on the damp earth. She stopped before Sarah and reached out a hand, gently touching her granddaughter's face. The touch was warm, comforting, and Sarah felt something inside her unravel, a tension she had carried for so long that she had forgotten it existed. "Forgiveness is not something asked for," Grandma Eleanor said. "Forgiveness is something earned, and you have a long journey ahead before you earn it." Daniel was the first to move, while Michael remained on his knees, paralyzed by shock, and Sarah sobbed in her grandmother's arms. He stepped forward and did something none of the siblings expected. He knelt before Grandma Eleanor, touched his forehead to the ground, and spoke the first words he had uttered in weeks. "I knew it was wrong. I knew, and I did nothing. That's worse than having the idea." Grandma Eleanor looked at him with an expression that blended sorrow and understanding. She bent down, took her grandson's chin, and gently raised it, forcing him to meet her gaze. "Silence in the face of injustice is a form of complicity," she said. "Is that something you just learned, or something you always knew?" Daniel swallowed hard. "I always knew. Grandma taught me when I was a child." "And yet you chose to be silent." It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Daniel nodded, unable to avert his eyes from that golden gaze that seemed to see through him, through his excuses, through all the lies he told himself. "The desert has taught me many things these past few months," Grandma Eleanor continued, standing tall again. It taught me that true strength isn't in surviving alone, but in helping others survive. It taught me that the most precious water is that which is shared. And it taught me that forgiveness is like rain in this dry land, rare, precious, and capable of making what seemed dead bloom. She made a sweeping gesture, encompassing the entire valley around them. Look at this place. When I arrived here, it was just another piece of desert, arid, barren, forgotten, but there was water underneath, hidden, waiting for someone who knew how to find it. I dug, I planted, I cared, and the desert responded. How? The question came from Michael, who had finally managed to stand. His voice was hoarse, broken, but in it was a genuine curiosity that had replaced his arrogance. How did you survive? How did you do all this? Grandma Eleanor smiled, and in that smile were echoes of the grandmother they knew. The woman who told stories by the fire, who made herbal remedies, who knew the name of every star in the sky. Do you know our family's story? Not the untold at birthdays, but the true story, the one whispered from mother to daughter? The three grandchildren exchanged confused glances. Sarah was the one who answered. You always said you had Native American blood, that our great-grandmother was from a tribe that lived in the desert lands. It wasn't just blood, Grandma Eleanor said. It was knowledge. Our family has always had a special connection to this land. The women of our lineage could sense water, hear the wind, understand the signs the desert gave. I always had this gift, but it was weak, dormant. When you left me tied to that stone, when I was about to die, something awakened, something that had been waiting for this moment for generations. She walked to the stream and knelt by the bank, dipping her hands into the crystal-clear water. I can't explain it in words. It's as if the desert has a consciousness, an ancient memory that remembers everyone who has ever inhabited it. And that consciousness chose me, not to get revenge on you, not to give me magical powers. It chose me to care for, to protect, to be the bridge between those who live here and the land that sustains them. Michael took a hesitant step toward his grandmother. And now? What's going to happen to us? Grandma Eleanor stood and wiped her hands on her clothes. Her eyes scanned her three grandchildren, one by one, as if reading something written on their souls. That depends on you. The desert showed me that each of you carries a different wound. Michael, you carry your father's wound, the ambition that consumed him, the fear of not being enough, the need to prove your worth. Sarah, you carry your mother's wound, the guilt of existing, the need to please everyone, the fear of being abandoned. And Daniel, you carry the wound of silence, the burden of seeing and not acting, of knowing and not speaking, of existing on the sidelines while life happens around you. The three remained silent, each processing their grandmother's words differently. Michael felt as if a mask he hadn't even known he wore had been ripped off. Sarah cried once more, but these were different tears now, of recognition instead of guilt. Daniel simply nodded, because the truth, when finally spoken aloud, needs no answer. I could send you away, Grandma Eleanor continued. I could point you toward the city and let you go your separate ways. The desert wouldn't kill you now, not while I'm here to ask it to be kind. But that would be too easy, for you and for me. She paused, allowing the sound of the stream to fill the silence. True forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's transformation, and you need to transform before you can be forgiven. What do you want us to do? Sarah asked, her voice still choked. I want you to stay. I want you to learn what I've learned. I want you to work, to sweat, to feel in your own bodies the weight of caring for something beyond yourselves. And I want you, when you're ready, to take this knowledge out of this valley and help others who are lost in the desert. Michael opened his mouth to protest, old habits still fighting to manifest, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps shame, perhaps a flicker of honesty he didn't know he possessed. He closed his mouth and nodded, a silent surrender that cost him more than any battle he had ever fought. The days that followed were the hardest the three grandchildren had ever faced. Grandma Eleanor was not a gentle teacher. She woke them before sunrise and put them to work until the stars appeared. There was water to fetch, goats to feed, fences to mend, land to plough, tasks none of them knew that made their muscles ache and their hands bleed. Michael complained on the first day, the second, the third. On the fourth, he fell silent because he realized his complaints changed nothing, and because he began to find a kind of unexpected relief in the physical work. There was something purifying about carrying buckets of water under the scorching sun, feeling sweat trickle down his back, falling exhausted at night and sleeping without dreams. It was as if each task erased a bit of the guilt he carried, as if the physical effort was a form of penance his body understood better than his mind. Sarah adapted more quickly. She discovered she had a knack for caring for animals. The goats liked her, and even the most aggressive roosters calmed down in her presence. Grandma Eleanor taught her to milk, to make cheese, to recognize when an animal was sick. And gradually, Sarah began to discover something she had never known about herself. She didn't need the approval of others to have worth. Her worth lay in what she did, in the care she devoted, in the kindness she offered, without expecting anything in return. Daniel was the most surprising. The silent grandson, who had always seemed to live on the fringes of his own life, revealed a connection to the earth that rivaled his grandmother's. He could sense where the water flowed strongest, instinctively knew where to plant for seeds to germinate, could predict changes in the weather just by looking at the sky. Grandma Eleanor watched him with a mix of pride and melancholy because she saw in him the same gift she possessed and knew the weight that gift carried. Weeks turned into months, and months began to accumulate like layers of sand. The valley flourished even more under the care of 4 people instead of 1. New wells were dug, new areas were planted, new goats were born and grew. And the 3 grandchildren, who had arrived as betrayers, slowly began to transform into something different. Michael lost his arrogance but gained determination. He stopped searching for an imaginary oasis and began to build a real one with his own hands. He learned to listen before speaking, to think before acting, to acknowledge his errors instead of blaming others. It wasn't a complete transformation because no one changes entirely, but it was a start. Sarah found her voice. She stopped being the shadow who agreed with everything and began to have opinions, to defend her ideas, to say no when necessary. She learned that being kind didn't mean being submissive, that caring for others didn't mean losing herself. And she discovered she had a talent for healing, not just animals, but people too, because the same gift that made her understand goats also helped her understand human suffering. And Daniel, the silent one, finally learned to speak. He didn't become talkative, he never would be, but his words gained weight. When he said something, people listened, because they knew he only spoke when it was important, and most significantly, he learned to act. Never again would he be the passive observer who watched injustice without intervening. But the greatest transformation happened on a full moon night, exactly 1 year after they had found their grandmother in the valley. The 3 were sitting around a campfire, resting after a long day of work, when Grandma Eleanor came to them with a solemn expression. "It's time," she said. "Time for what?" Michael asked, and there was concern in his voice, no longer arrogance. "Time for you to leave. The desert needs more guardians, and you are ready." Sarah felt her heart clench. "Leave? But this is our home now." Grandma Eleanor smiled, and in that smile was an ancient sadness, the same as all mothers and grandmothers who watch their children grow and depart. Home is not a place, my granddaughter. Home is what we carry within us. You've learned what you needed to learn here. Now you need to take that knowledge to other places, other people. The desert is vast, and there are many who need help. And you, Grandma? Daniel asked, his voice thick with emotion. Will you be alone? I am never alone, Grandma Eleanor replied. The desert is with me, always has been. Their departure was set for 3 days later, enough time for each to prepare in their own way. Grandma Eleanor spent those days teaching the last secrets she hadn't yet shared. To Michael, she showed how to find invisible paths between the dunes, trails that seemed not to exist but led to the most improbable places. To Sarah, she taught recipes for remedies made from desert plants, salves that healed wounds, teas that lowered fevers, mixtures that eased pains no doctor could treat. And to Daniel, she shared something deeper, the art of listening to what the earth had to say. On the morning of their departure, the sun rose red, tinging the sky with colors that seemed like a premonition. Grandma Eleanor awoke before everyone else, as she always did, but that day there was something different. In her movements, a slowness that wasn't fatigue, but rather the awareness that each gesture could be her last. She prepared breakfast with the care of someone creating a memory, and when her grandchildren awoke, they found the table set as it was on Sundays of their childhood, when their grandmother still lived in the old house and the family still existed as a family. Eat well, she said. The road is long. They ate in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Michael thought of the man he had been a year before, the cruel leader who had abandoned his own grandmother to die. He seemed like another person, someone he barely recognized. Sarah thought of the hugs she hadn't given, the words she hadn't said, all the years she had spent apologizing for existing. Daniel thought of silence, his old companion, and how he had learned to transform it from a prison into a choice. After breakfast, Grandma Eleanor led them to the entrance of the valley, the same place they had arrived a year before, stumbling and desperate. Now they walked upright, their bodies strengthened by work, their eyes clear with purpose. They were different people, and the desert around them seemed to recognize this change. Each of you will follow a different path, Grandma Eleanor said. Michael, you will go north, where communities are more isolated and help takes longer to arrive. Sarah, you will go east, where there are towns that need someone to care for their sick. And Daniel, you will stay here with me for a while longer. Your gift is special, and it needs more time to mature. Daniel felt a mix of relief and disappointment. Relief at not having to leave yet, at having more time with the grandmother he had almost lost. Disappointment because deep down he wanted to prove he was capable of walking alone, of being more than the silent one who observed without acting. It's not weakness, Grandma Eleanor said, as if reading his thoughts. It's wisdom. You will be the last to leave, but you will be the one who goes the furthest. Your path is still being drawn. The goodbyes were brief, not for lack of love, but because there are moments when words are insufficient. Michael hugged his grandmother with a strength that said everything he couldn't express. "Forgive me," he whispered in her ear. "Thank you." Sarah cried, as she always did at farewells, but her tears were different now. They were tears of gratitude, not fear. "I love you, Grandma. I always loved you, even when I didn't know how to show it." And then they left, each in their own direction, 2 points moving away under the relentless sun until they disappeared on the horizon. Grandma Eleanor stood at the entrance of the valley for a long time, until Daniel touched her shoulder. "Are you all right, Grandma?" She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I'm old, my grandson. Even with all the desert has given me, I'm still human, and humans feel the pain of separation." The following months were quiet in the valley. Grandma Eleanor continued her usual work, caring for the animals, the plants, the lost travelers who occasionally appeared. Daniel was her constant shadow, learning more and more about the earth's secrets. He discovered he could hear not only underground water, but also the movements of distant animals, changes in air pressure that announced storms, even the moods of approaching people. "It's a heavy gift," Grandma Eleanor said one night as they watched the stars. "You'll know things you don't want to know. You'll feel pains that aren't yours. You'll carry burdens no one else can see." "I know," Daniel replied, "but I'll also be able to help in ways others can't." She nodded, satisfied with the answer. "You've matured more than your siblings, perhaps because you had more to mature." News of the other two arrived sporadically, brought by travelers passing through the valley. Michael had found a community in the north that was on the brink of collapse. The drought had killed almost all their livestock, and people were starting to leave in search of better land. But Michael had shown them where to dig new wells, how to conserve water, how to survive with less. Within a few months the community was recovering, and people spoke of him with a reverence that would have fed his ego in the past, but which now made him feel only responsibility. The most visible transformation was internal. Michael, who once couldn't admit any error, now made a point of publicly acknowledging his flaws. When one of his decisions proved wrong, he was the first to say so, and that honesty earned him more respect than any success ever would. People trusted him not because he was perfect, but because he was genuine. He married at 38 to a woman named Olivia, who came from one of the neighboring communities. She was a widow with 2 young children, and Michael adopted them as his own. When the couple's first baby was born, a girl, they named her Eleanor, in honor of the grandmother who had made it all possible. The birth was difficult, and Michael spent the entire night outside the house, pacing back and forth, praying to saints he didn't believe in, and to the desert he had learned to respect. When the baby's cry finally broke the silence of dawn, he fell to his knees and wept, from relief and gratitude, and from something nameless that filled his chest until it ached. Olivia survived, the baby was healthy, and life continued. But that night, holding his daughter for the first time, Michael understood something he never had before. He understood what it meant to love someone more than himself. He understood what his grandmother must have felt raising them, caring for them, watching them grow and transform into people who would abandon her in the desert. And he understood, finally, the magnitude of the forgiveness she had given them. Sarah in the East became a living legend. The Lightbringer, as they still called her, was sought out by people from all over the desert lands and beyond. She cured illnesses doctors deemed incurable, calmed minds that had lost their sanity, brought peace to hearts that had forgotten what hope was. She didn't charge for her services, accepting only what people could give: food, fabric, sometimes just a sincere thank you. She never married, not because she lacked opportunities, but because she discovered her path was different. There was an intimacy in her work that replaced the intimacy of a relationship, a connection with each person she touched that was both profound and ephemeral. Each healing was a farewell, each patient a fleeting love that left carrying a piece of her. At 40, she began to teach, not healing techniques, because those couldn't be taught. They were gifts that came with birth, or not at all, but other things: how to listen, how to be present, how to offer compassion without losing oneself in it. Her students, all women, scattered across the desert lands like seeds in the wind, each carrying a little of Sarah's light to places where it had never shone. The valley remained a meeting point, the place where the 3 siblings gathered every year on the anniversary of their grandmother's passing. It was a tradition they never broke, no matter what was happening in their lives. They came from afar, often walking for days on end, to spend a night under the cottonwood tree, telling stories, remembering their grandmother, renewing vows that needed no words. At one of these gatherings, almost 10 years after Grandma Eleanor's passing, Daniel announced he was ready to war. "Leave. I've found others," he said. "People like me, like Grandma, scattered across the desert lands, across the country, maybe even the world. I need to find them, gather them, create a network of guardians like Grandma dreamed of." Michael and Sarah exchanged a look. They knew this day would come. Their grandmother had prophesied it, but it still hurt. The valley without Daniel would be a different place, emptier in ways that had nothing to do with physical space. "Who will take care of the valley?" Sarah asked. Daniel smiled. "The valley takes care of itself now. Grandma did her work, but I will train someone before I leave. A girl who appeared here a few months ago. She has the gift, I can feel it. It's weak still, as mine was, but it can be developed." And so it was. The girl's name was Emma. She was 17 and had eyes that seemed to see beyond the visible. She had arrived in the valley, fleeing a family who thought her crazy, who wanted to institutionalize her because she heard voices no one else heard. Daniel found her wandering through the dunes, dehydrated and desperate, and brought her to the valley as his grandmother had once brought him. Emma's training lasted 2 years, during which Daniel passed on everything he knew. It wasn't just practical knowledge. It was a way of seeing the world, a philosophy of life rooted in his grandmother, and branching out in directions even she couldn't have foreseen. Emma absorbed everything with a hunger that resembled Daniel's own early hunger, and when he finally left, she cried, but didn't try to stop him. "Will you come back?" she asked. Daniel touched the cottonwood tree one last time, feeling the presence of his grandmother who still inhabited that place. "Always," he said. "This is my home. No matter where I am, a part of me will always be here." Daniel's journey took him to places he had never imagined, great cities where the gift seemed suffocated by concrete and noise. Forests where the earth spoke in languages he had to learn, mountains where the silence was so profound he could hear his own thoughts echoing. And in each place he found people like him, some aware of their gifts, others trying to ignore them, all needing guidance. He didn't create a formal organization because he understood that the gift couldn't be institutionalized. He created something more fluid, a network of connections that stayed alive through shared stories, occasional encounters, a mutual understanding that transcended words. The Guardians, as they came to be known, spread across the world as Grandma Eleanor's grandchildren had spread across the desert lands, each caring for their piece of earth, their piece of humanity. Meanwhile, the legend of the abandoned old woman grew and transformed. Storytellers carried it from fair to fair, from town to town, adding details, changing names, adapting it for their audiences. In some versions, Grandma Eleanor became a saint. In others, a benevolent witch. In still others, a personified force of nature. But the core of the story remained. An old woman left to die who found strength in adversity and transformed her pain into a gift. The 3 grandchildren sometimes heard these stories in unexpected places and smiled. Grandma would have liked that, they thought. She had always loved a good story. On a summer night, almost 20 years after Grandma Eleanor's passing, Michael awoke with a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't pain, it was more like a presence, something or someone trying to get his attention. He got up without waking Olivia and left the house, walking under the stars, until he reached the top of a hill from which he could see the entire horizon. And there, in the dark sky, he saw something that made him fall to his knees. A shooting star, the brightest he had ever seen, streaked across the sky from east to west, leaving a trail of light that took long seconds to dissipate. And as he watched it, Michael could have sworn he heard his grandmother's voice, whispering on the wind. "I'm proud of you," the voice said. "So proud," He never told anyone about that night. Some things are too personal to be shared. But he kept the memory deep in his heart, a treasure that warmed him on cold days and guided him in moments of doubt. The family continued. Little Eleanor grew up and had children, who in turn had children. Michael's adopted children married and built their own families. And in all these families, the story of their great-grandmother was told, passed down from generation to generation, like an inheritance more valuable than any property. Sarah died at 67, peacefully, surrounded by the students who had become her daughters by heart. Her last words were a request to be buried in the valley, beside her grandmother. And so it was done. Michael lived to 83, long enough to see great-grandchildren and to watch the world change in ways he had never imagined. When he felt his time was drawing near, he asked to be taken to the valley as well, and there, beneath the cottonwood tree that was now immense, he closed his eyes and departed. Daniel was the last. He continued his work until he was 75, when his body finally gave out. He returned to the valley to die, as he had always known he would, and Emma, now a middle-aged woman with her own apprentices, was there to receive him. "You did well," she said, holding his hand. "Grandma would be proud." "She is," Daniel whispered. "I can feel her. She never left." And with those words, the last of the 3 grandchildren departed to join the grandmother they had abandoned in the desert, and who had taught them the true meaning of forgiveness. The valley beneath the cottonwood tree exists to this day, though few know how to find it. The mountains surrounding it seem to shift. The paths leading to it become muddled and lost, and only those who truly need to can reach it. That's how it should be, say the guardians. Some places aren't meant to be found, they are meant to find you. Emma passed the leadership of the valley to her own apprentice, a young woman named Chloe, who appeared in the dunes on a stormy day. And Chloe, in turn, passed it to another and another, in an unbroken chain that connects the present to the past, like the roots of a tree connect the branches to the earth. Beneath the cottonwood tree, 4 graves rest side by side. Grandma Eleanor, the matriarch who transformed abandonment into purpose. Sarah, the healer who found strength in kindness. Michael, the leader who learned humility. And Daniel, the silent one who gave voice to the earth. Over each grave, wildflowers grow year-round, even during the severest droughts, as if the earth itself refused to leave them without color. The story that began with a betrayal ended with a blessing. The broken family was mended in ways that made it stronger than ever. And the desert, that place of death everyone feared, revealed itself to be a place of transformation, of healing, of new beginnings. Grandma Eleanor's descendants spread across the world. Some carry the gift, others don't, but all carry the story. It is told at family gatherings, on full moon nights, in moments of crisis, when someone needs to remember that redemption is possible. And each time it is told, Grandma Eleanor lives again, her words echoing through the generations, like the whisper of the wind across the dunes. There were those who tried to turn the story into a moral lesson, reducing it to a simple, "Don't abandon your elders." But it's more than that. It's about the power of choice, about the human capacity to change, about forgiveness that doesn't erase the past, but builds a different future. It's about accepting that we are all imperfect, all capable of cruelty, but also all capable of redemption. The guardians. Daniel gathered continue their work, spread across the world like invisible sentinels. They wear no uniforms, hold no titles, answer to no authority beyond their own conscience. They are teachers, doctors, artists, farmers, ordinary people with an extraordinary gift and a responsibility few would understand. When the world seems on the brink of collapse, when hope seems lost, They are there working in the shadows, maintaining the balance that allows humanity to continue. And at the center of it all, like the heart of an infinite network, is the valley beneath the cottonwood tree. Travelers still arrive there, lost and desperate, and are received with water, food, and a promise. Here you can transform. Here you can leave behind who you were and become who you are meant to be. It's not easy. It's not quick. But it is possible. If an old woman left to die could become the guardian of an entire desert, anyone can find their purpose. The last time someone from outside saw the valley was a few decades ago. An anthropologist studying isolated communities in the desertlands heard rumors about a hidden place in the mountains and decided to investigate. He walked for days, following clues that seemed to lead him in circles, until finally, on an unexpected rainy afternoon, he found the passage between the rocks. What he saw left him speechless. A true oasis in the middle of nowhere with fruit trees, a crystal-clear stream, and goats that seemed unafraid of humans. And in the center, beneath the shade of an immense cottonwood tree, a white-haired woman looked at him as if she already knew he would come. "You are lost," she said. "Not in the geographical sense. You know exactly where you are. You are lost in other ways." The anthropologist stayed for 3 weeks in the valley. He tried to document everything, take notes, snap photographs, but his notes became muddled and his photographs came out blurry, as if the place refused to be captured. What he took with him was something different, a peace he'd never felt before, a clarity about his own path that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He never published anything about the valley. When colleagues asked about his expedition, he gave vague answers, changed the subject. Some truths aren't meant for academic papers. Some experiences cannot be reduced to words on a page. But he did tell the story. He told it to his daughter, who told it to her children, who will tell it to their grandchildren. And so the story continues. Like a river that never stops flowing, nourishing lands it has never seen, and people it will never know. In the end, perhaps that's what Grandma Eleanor always wanted. Not a monument, not an institution, not a religion. Just a story that keeps being told, that keeps inspiring, that keeps reminding people that forgiveness is possible, that redemption is real, that it's never too late to change. The sun sets over the desert, painting the dunes in colors that seem impossible. A gentle breeze carries the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of running water. Somewhere beyond the mountains, a lost traveler begins to walk in a direction he hadn't planned, guided by something he can't explain. The valley awaits him. The desert breathes, and Grandma Eleanor somehow, somewhere smiles, because the story never truly ends. It just changes narrators. The 3 grandchildren who had once abandoned her to die became the 3 pillars of a new tradition. The leader who only thought of himself learned to serve. The guilt-ridden one who couldn't say no learned to set boundaries. The silent one who never acted learned to speak when it mattered. And together, guided by the spirit of a grandmother who loved them even when they didn't deserve it, they changed a piece of the world. It's not a story of miracles, though miracles happened. It's not a story of magic, though inexplicable things occurred. It's a story of people, of flesh and blood and flaws and regrets, and above all of second chances. Because in the end, that's what it's about. Second chances. The opportunity to do differently, to be better, to transform the worst moment of your life into the first step of a journey of redemption. Grandma Eleanor knew this when she forgave her grandchildren. She knew that forgiveness wasn't just for them, it was for her too. It was the refusal to let betrayal define her story, the choice to write a different ending than the one fate seemed to have reserved. And now, generations later, her legacy lives on. In the stories told by the fire, in the guardians who protect the land, in the descendants who carry her blood and her name, and in the valley beneath the cottonwood tree, where 4 graves rest in peace, surrounded by flowers that never wilt and a memory that will never be forgotten. The desert can be cruel, life can be unfair, the people we love can disappoint us in the most painful ways possible. But as long as stories like this are being told, as long as there are people willing to believe in redemption, as long as there are hearts open to forgiveness, there will be hope. And hope, like water in the desert, is the most precious commodity there is. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered.